This is the history, the mystery, and the racial conflicts of Lake Lanier. By the end of this, you'll have enough knowledge to create your own informed opinions about what all the fuss is about. We'll be talking about the night riders, the executions, the number of deaths that have occurred at this lake, and even some more recent ones. One that actually touched a famous rapper that I'm sure you know of. Today on Adventure Explore Discover, we are at the one, the only, Lake Lanier. In 1912, an 18-year-old girl, May Crow, was murdered and sexually assaulted. However, this was so long ago, DNA tests and forensics were nowhere near what they are today. So at the time, the people did the only thing they thought to do. They blamed the people that were nearest to the death, which in this case happened to be Ernest Knox, Oscar Daniel, and Rob Edwards. They had found a small mirror that was said to belong to Ernest, but it was a fairly common article, and it really could have come from anyone. It's sad to say that even many of May Crow's family said that the two kids were probably innocent. Some claim that she was knocked out, came to, and identified her attackers, but she never actually did. Sadly, there is no irrefutable evidence that Ernest and Oscar were actually guilty. Before they could be tried, Rob Edwards would be lynched by a mob without a judge's consent, which is why the supposed group they were a part of needed to be protected by a militia. Ernest was 16 years old and had to have a special noose made for him as to not be decapitated and splash blood on the people that watched. Oscar Daniel and Ernest Knox were tried and executed on October 25th, 1912, by an all-white jury, might I add. People were also said to be picnicking as they watched their execution. A couple weeks later, another woman known as Ellen Grice would come forward, and she said she was almost sexually assaulted by two men, but luckily, because her mother was there, they had gotten scared of getting caught and ran off, or so the story goes. Now keep in mind, she had survived her supposed attack. She was able to identify the man or men that were supposedly responsible. With that being said, for some reason the police decided to arrest 5 men for the alleged assault. And around this time, a man known as Grant Smith, who was a vocal black preacher, tried to speak to the sheriff to see if they could be released. I think he claimed that essentially because the attack was said to be by 2 men and not 5, that there wasn't really any sense in keeping all of these men locked up. And much to the dismay of public opinion, Pastor Smith had even said that she and one of the young men were probably in a consensual relationship. And let me just say, this is a really spicy topic. You have a 22-year-old girl and her mother saying that 2 men tried to assault her, but failed. So 5 men were arrested. And a preacher comes forth saying she was in a relationship with one of her accused assailants. It's a nightmare on all ends. Well, the people who had heard the accusations of Pastor Smith didn't like it at all. They ended up beating and horsewhipping the preacher on the steps of the courthouse. They assaulted him so badly that he nearly died. It was these 2 events that would cause the horrific actions that would later be brought on by the Night Riders. But before we talk about what they did to the black communities in the area, there's something else that we should know. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to many people, the Chattahoochee River that flowed past Oscarville, a town that was a thriving black American farming community, was beginning to dry out. Many don't understand why the Chattahoochee is so important, but it's much more than just a river. The Chattahoochee isn't just in Georgia. This river flows through Georgia, Alabama, and even Florida. It goes all the way into the Gulf of Mexico, and this river alone was a source of income for each one of these 3 states, and it was going to dry up. And on top of the economic impact, The ACF river basin that this river flows into is home to some very sensitive and unique species. Without this river, they would cease to exist, and there would be multiple problems that come along with it. After May Crow had been murdered within a couple miles of the Chattahoochee River, a group of racist extremists called the Night Riders would start a very dark and brutal time in American history. The Night Riders is a name given to a militant faction of tobacco farmers. They were based in Kentucky, and their original purpose was to actually oppose the American tobacco trade, or the American Tobacco Company, excuse me. They wanted everyone to boycott the ATC because they made tobacco prices so low that the farmers just couldn't stand to make a profit. But it was the murder of May Crow that actually brought their unwanted presence into Georgia. The Night Riders would make their way out of Tennessee and Kentucky down to Georgia, all the way into Forsyth County, and they would destroy anything and everything that belonged to a Black American at that time. But it didn't end at vandalism and destruction. I just want to take a minute to go back over some things that aren't in this portion of the video. There were said to be Night Riders in Georgia at that time that came to Forsyth, but they came from Cherokee County, which is on the other side of the Smokies, if I'm not wrong. I don't know how accurate that is, since the tobacco farms in Georgia aren't even primarily in that county. They may have come from other parts of Georgia, but again, maybe not. I can't tell fact from fiction here, so there's no telling where they came from. They were based in Kentucky and Tennessee, which doesn't have the issue of an entire mountain range in their path, so they may have come from either place. I just wanted to add this for as much information and accuracy as possible. But regardless of where they came from, what was it the Night Riders did when they came to Forsyth County? They would haphazardly fire guns into houses, shatter windows and homes, and on some occasion, they'd even burn the houses to the ground. But in my opinion, the worst of all is that they would take a stick of dynamite, light it up, and toss it into a home with the people inside, seriously maiming, if not killing, all of them. They murdered and harassed the people of this town, but not everyone in Forsyth was okay with this. While yes, there was a large population of racist activists in Forsyth County, not everyone agreed with the murderous acts of the Night Riders. In fact, when they followed the Black residents they pushed out into Hall County, the sheriff and white landlords joined together to fight off the group of racist extremists. As for what happened before then, a group of prominent white Americans had come forward, including the mayor, Charlie Harris, of Cumming, Georgia. And they had sent a letter to Governor Brown, begging and pleading with him to declare martial law so that way all the police could come into Forsyth County and protect these Black Americans. Brown would ultimately deny the request, and the Black Americans that lived in Forsyth were all pushed out of their county because of the continuous onslaught of these racially charged attacks. Essentially, their only options were to start over somewhere new or stay and die. Many believe these men terrorized the citizens of Oscarville, but it is never specified what towns they attacked. That could be because a lot of the towns that now sit below Lake Lanier have lost their names to time. So we could assume it was Oscarville that they attacked, but for some reason, no source I've ever looked through has ever explicitly said Oscarville was attacked by the Night Riders. However, a short video from 11 Alive News interviewed a man, George Rucker, said to be able to trace back his family 4 generations all the way back to Oscarville. His great-grandfather was Bert Oliver, who described the attacks from the Night Riders on Oscarville. He said they were all forced to swim across a river where they were going to be shot. Oliver managed to make it across the river, but many others did not. This conflicts with the other reports saying that 98 families from Oscarville were paid off and 2 were forced out. So again, I'm just not really sure what the real story is. It is possible that Bert Oliver didn't live in Oscarville itself, but one of the surrounding towns that lost its name. At this point, history has gotten so muddy that it's not really fair to say yes or no to anyone, especially when he probably had this conversation with his great-grandfather face to face. All we know for sure is the Night Riders came from out of town to attack the black community because they were using May Crow's death as an excuse to act on their racist agenda. So while the mayor of Cumming, Georgia, Charlie Harris, was denied his request for martial law by Governor Joseph Mackey Brown, these racist extremists forced 1,100 black Americans out of Forsyth County, and all of this happened 50 years before the lake was under construction. There's a debate as to why the lake was made at all, and while that question will be left for you to decide, I'll tell you what the lake is used for in a minute. But first, what about Oscarville? We understand the history of the Night Riders, but what do we actually know about Oscarville itself? Not much, sadly. Multiple sources say that this was a strong farming community, and that there was a total of 100 to 150 families living there. And I think that's one belief that's true. I only say assumption due to the lack of solid information of what Oscarville was like. Eventually, when it came time for the lake to be built, Oscarville stood in its path. The Georgia government offered the families a lump sum of cash to leave, and most of them did. But this could be compared to how you buy a brand new car, drive it off the lot and next door, and they give you a fraction of what it's actually worth. Their land was valuable, but the government was going to pay full price for a piece of land that was eventually going to be at the bottom of a lake, especially when things such as eminent domain exist. That basically means if you're living on a piece of land and the government needs it for the betterment of society, they can just take it from you without paying you or anything. They can still do that too. The most popular examples would be the Hoover Dam, Central Park in New York, and the Dallas Cowboys Stadium. However, some people are very confused on the lake's creation in regards to Oscarville. Some legends say that citizens were drowned to make the lake, but I highly doubt that. It's just very unlikely. It took a total of 2 weeks to fill the lake, and there are 0 eyewitness testimonies saying that this actually happened. However, there are a few sources that say people were dragged out kicking and screaming, and I'm not sure if this is some confusion between Oscarville and the events with the Night Riders, but I've read somewhere, but I can't remember the site, that 98 families were paid to leave and 2 of them were forced out. So these 2 families may have been dragged out kicking and screaming. It's actually a very real possibility, but it wasn't the entire town like some people would have you believe. There was roughly 150 families before the Night Riders and around 100 after they left in the surrounding areas of Forsyth County. And those 100 would be paid to leave or forced to leave. And also, I highly doubt that people were drowned in the creation of this lake. Let me just put it in perspective. The lowest point of Lake Lanier is at 160 feet. So that means if you're at the center of the valley that was once there, which isn't even necessarily where Oscarville was, you would be affected first. Now, you can look this up. It took 2 weeks to fill up this lake. And if we take those measurements, 2 weeks equals 336 hours to fill 160 feet. If you divide the amount of feet that was filled in 336 hours, you get roughly 5.5 inches per hour. But that only starts if you're at the bottom of the valley. So every 4 hours, you get less than 2 feet of water. So if for some reason they started to fill the lake up at 9 p.m. while people were sleeping, they could get 8 hours of sleep before any water reached them if they were just 4 feet higher than the lowest point of the valley. I doubt anybody was tricked into staying and then there was a flash flood that they poured down on top of people's houses. That's not the way it works. So if somebody tells you that people were drowned to make this lake, it would take around 12 hours of standing in place for it to even get up to a point to where a child would drown. And then they'd also have to stand in place and start purposefully inhaling water. And this could potentially be faster or even slower based on the terrain. But even if it was twice as fast, it would take 6 hours to fill up 5 feet. And again, that's at the very bottom of the lake. Now, I wouldn't put it past anyone, but unless somebody tied someone else down to a part of their house, there's almost 0 possibility that someone was sleeping at night and then just drowned. Unless they decided to stay, in which case they kind of did that to themselves. That's one of those rumors that has lasted a while, and without any evidence, it's really just been added to make the story more controversial than it already is. So 50 years after the land that the Night Riders stole was given or sold to the Georgia government, and the remaining citizens of Oscarville were gone, the creation of the lake would begin. But here's the question you're probably still wondering. Did they make the lake to expunge the black Americans that lived there? What was the true reason behind creating Lake Lanier? Well, let's look at what this lake does, and then I want you to tell me what you think in the comments. The hydroelectric pump that is powered by Lake Lanier produces, I don't know. I can't do the math on it and I couldn't find the information anywhere. So I'm going to assume that the 130 megawatts this page was referring to is per day, which would mean this lake produces enough electricity to power 4,300 houses per day. With an average family of 3 to 4 people, that's anywhere between 13,000 people or more. Here is the conversion from megawatt to kilowatt. It's not enough for all of Georgia, but it's also clean and renewable energy. If you know the actual math, then please let me know in the comments. The following is an excerpt from a site that I'll link in the description. I would say it in my own words, but I think saying it exactly as was written is the best that could be said. And again, the link is in the description if you want to know more. A major function of Lake Lanier is flood control. During times of heavy rainfall, runoff waters are stored in Lake Lanier to help prevent flooding downstream of Beaufort Dam. Later, after the heavy rains have subsided, floodwaters stored in the lake can be released through the powerhouse in a more controlled manner. It is estimated that approximately $2 billion worth of property is located in the floodplain downstream of Lake Lanier and is protected from flooding by Beaufort Dam. So a quick tangent about Lake Lanier. I've been told by a couple people that I should use a drone and that it would definitely take my videos up a notch, and having those big swooping drone shots would really help show the scale of the places I go to. And I actually do have a drone. However, I was out here a couple years ago and I was flying my drone around when all of a sudden a car with lights flashing showed up behind me. It's apparently illegal to fly over the lake because if I flew over the dam, then they said it would have been a severe threat to the city below it. So the gentleman looked at my footage, realized I was just having fun, and gave me a warning citation. So when they say this dam is protecting the city, it really is. And if it weren't for this lake and that dam, that city wouldn't exist. But just before we get to some numbers and the death that touched the life of someone you've probably listened to on the radio or in the Super Bowl halftime show, we got to talk about the river. One of the primary reasons they made this lake was to save the Chattahoochee River. Without this river and lake, millions and millions of people would have to find a drinkable water source from somewhere else. And that's not only including Georgia, but Alabama and Florida too. This river even flows through Tennessee. The Chattahoochee River is absolutely vital to so many different aspects of what it does. It's incredible that we've utilized it so much and for so many different things. Lastly, just the lake alone is a water source for over 5 million people and over 70% of Metro Atlanta. And again, I'm going to refer to a column written by Sabrina Kearns as to what the creation of this lake was intended for. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers built Lake Sidney Lanier in the 1950s in conjunction with Beaufort Dam. The project was part of a much larger mission across the U.S. directly after World War II to develop the nation's waterways, according to a previous 400 Life story. Coughlin said that the U.S. government sought out the construction of Lake Lanier and Beaufort Dam specifically to help provide a water source to residents near Atlanta. Some used the dam as a power source for surrounding homes and help prevent flooding from the Chattahoochee River. According to this article, funding to build the lake was approved in 1949 and also goes to say nearly half of the cost of the multi-million-dollar project was spent buying land and relocating the families, the churches, and even grave sites that used to reside on the land that now makes up the bottom of Lake Lanier. The cost was a total of $45 million to make Lake Lanier, meaning around $22.5 million was used to relocate people and grave sites, and to also make sure that the debris at the bottom wouldn't be a hazard in the future, but as we all know, they probably skimped on those costs. During the middle of its construction, the lake was filled with water, but the trees that were once there still stuck out of the water. So before they finished filling the lake to max capacity, they cut down the tops of the trees to take care of them. The problem with that is there were still massive trees in the lake, and now you can't even tell where they are because they're hidden beneath the surface. That, along with debris at the bottom, the relocation and clearing of the area definitely needed a lot more attention. After 5 years of preparation and construction, Lake Lanier would finally be finished with the completion of Buford Dam. But the mysterious deaths that surround the lake itself have yet to begin. Since its formation, this lake has claimed over 600 people's lives. And by the time that you're watching this, it's probably even higher. Now, some say this is due to the traumatic events that plague its past, while others say because of the actions of the Night Riders that this land is cursed and evil spirits still lurk in the depths of this lake. There's even legends that blame ghosts and demons being the cause of unnatural deaths due to the bodies of those that have drowned and never been recovered. Or even the graves that were missed or forgotten whenever they were relocating everything. Because unlike most, that is not one of the myths of this lake. There are still bodies and there are still graves in the depths. But others say the curse of the lake goes back even further, the time before Oscarville, before the Night Riders, all the way back when this land belonged to the Cherokee and the Creek. And because of the Trail of Tears, this land was always destined to be a hotbed for evil. You know, perhaps you can take the land from the monster, but you can't take the monster from the land. Now, I am in no way a Cherokee or Creek folklore expert, but I can tell you that I've never come across some sort of spell or incantation that you can cast upon an area to curse something, kind of like the Skinwalker curse. Now, the Skinwalker curse is specifically from the Ute tribe, and it's not even something that can be cast. That entire thing is actually a myth. Skinwalkers are actually just people that practice a type of dark magic. For the Cherokee and the Creek, the darkest parts of the woods were already home to monsters. Others use more modern explanations of how and why this lake has claimed so many lives. They say that because there are millions of tourists and overall the extreme number of visitors that, of course, this lake is going to have a higher amount of deaths than an ordinary location. They say the millions and millions of people that come here come to have a good time and party, and that alcohol is often a common theme among those that have drowned in this lake. Others say that Lake Lanier is home to monster-sized catfish that don't need to feed on the leftovers and scraps of others. They're said to be so massive, they could swallow a child whole to never be seen or heard from again. And when you have images like this circulating the internet, claiming to have been a catfish caught at Lake Lanier, it makes you wonder what kind of monsters really are lurking in the depths. And it isn't just ordinary lakegoers that encounter strange and tragic deaths. People from every walk of life are brought to their knees by the brutality that surrounds this lake. But before we talk about Kyle, let's look at one of the biggest legends, the Lady of the Lake. One of the first notable occurrences of Lake Lanier is the story of the Lady of the Lake, which is a reference to the deaths of Delia Mae Parker Young and her friend Susie Roberts. The two were taking off from a gas station after having not paid for their fuel. They had been driving very, very fast. They were going across Brown's Bridge, and their car had flipped over the railing and into the lake. Now, 18 months after this accident, a fisherman was out here and he saw something floating in the water. As he got closer, he could see that it was a large bloated corpse. It was Delia, or so it was believed to be, since it had on the same blue dress that Delia was wearing the day that they had flown over the bridge. Except Delia wasn't all there. She was missing both of her hands, some of her toes. Now, this is most likely due to the catfish that live in the lake picking her apart. And strangely enough, some people claim that they've been traveling across Brown's Bridge at night and they see a ghostly apparition of a young woman in a blue dress without hands. But then 3 decades later, another body would surface, and this was believed to be Susie Roberts. And these were just the first 2 deaths in the long list that would soon follow. You know, even to present day, this lake is plagued by tragedy. Kyle was an 11-year-old boy that was out here enjoying the lake like millions do. And he was wading in the water with a floaty, just enjoying the coolness that Lake Lanier had to offer, when a man on a personal watercraft ran over him and a 15-year-old girl. Now, the girl would go on to recover, but Kyle wouldn't make it. He died due to a brain injury from the impact of the watercraft. The man was sentenced to 4 years in prison, but Kyle's mom was sentenced to a life without her little boy. His mom was Tamika Foster, the ex-wife of R&B artist Usher. Now, before then, Usher was Kyle's stepdad, and he remained very close to the family during this time despite no longer being married to Tamika. Kids really do bring out the best in us. And originally, I didn't like the idea of spreading these stories around, but I personally have come to believe that the only thing worse than knowing that somebody died here is everybody not knowing. Since we know what happened, then we can be better prepared as parents and just as people in general. So those of you looking to vacation at Lake Lanier, just be sure that you know how to swim, that you're aware of your surroundings, and try not to go into the water by yourself. And the tragedies of this lake don't show any sign of stopping anytime soon. Even to this day, lives are being lost at this massive lake. Some of them we still don't understand how or why. People claim that there's some sort of unseen force sapping the strength out of them, and that they feel as though there's some kind of thing or creature latching onto them, beckoning them to the depths of this lake. So now that you know all about this place, why don't you tell me, would you like to go swimming in Lake Lanier? If you made it this far, I just want to say thank you for watching. And if you'd like to support me, the link to my Patreon is in the description below. Or you could just check out this video that YouTube seems to think you'll love. And I'll see you there. But just remember, where mystery lies, adventure awaits.